Hey, so I'm here and I am going live creating this video in response to some things that happened last week to give a little bit more clarity and a little bit more understanding in relation to certain things that were said by one of the officials in the church here in the United States. So let me just get started. Again, this is really about fostering collaboration, understanding, and helping people to move through part of what's going on right now in the world. I mean, what was said was in relation to the world and in relation to certain events that are going on. So it's a lot more helpful if I do a video and explain a little bit so people can have a full understanding instead of jumping to conclusions about certain things and then getting upset about them. So I'm going to be very particular in this video, and I am going to use names at this point because it's kind of important that I do for clarity reasons. So let's get started. Last week, the president of the USCCB came out and made a statement about movements. We also see another cardinal in the church doing the same thing this week, but I'm going to try to stay focused in this video on last week and what was stated and help people to work through that. So Gomez is the president of the USCCB, and he made statements about political movements and how most of the movements that are happening right now are political movements or he made a statement addressing political movements and stating to everyone in the church to focus on Christ. So instead of being swayed by the political movements, there was backlash about that. There were many groups who spoke up and said something and thought that he did not have understanding about what was occurring. Some of them were Black Catholics in the church, as well as other groups within the church that some people would say are marginalized groups. I'm saying that because there were different groups that spoke out, and some were not marginalized groups, some were marginalized groups. So with that being said, some people felt that the president of the USCCB, I just forgot the word for it, but that he kind of blew off the importance of the movements and them being tied to the Catholic faith. So where he labeled movements as political movements, there was many who felt that the movements that are happening right now are part of our Catholic faith, and we're not wrong for engaging in movements and contributing in some way. So once that was said, and even in the statement that he made, he referenced another prelate in the church, I'm pretty sure, and stated that some of these movements were backed in Marxist theory and all of this other stuff, which we're going to go into. We're going to debunk all of this. That's why I'm doing this. So the first thing that I will say is, we've journeyed with many people in different positions in the world, right? So different positions in the church, different positions in politics, different positions in the workplace, different positions in families, different positions in different countries, different states of life, different different walks and journeys, okay, for everyone. So we've seen many things happen during this time of the pandemic. I'm going to start with that. The pandemic itself has caused all countries to really evaluate what they're doing in their country and what they're doing outside of it. This was also fully present at the UNGA. All the countries came forward and said what was real for them during the pandemic, what they saw were issues, what they saw needed to change, and what was going really well. So let's start with that piece. The second piece is that every country has had to have a moment where they've had to face what is the path forward and what does this look like for us. Also know that pandemics they're like a catalyst for change, but also a catalyst sometimes for conflict, depending on how a country or an area is addressing the pandemic or isn't able to address the pandemic. So even within our own country, and the president of the USCCB said this, so I'm definitely going to speak about our country. Even in our own country, we saw this play out, but we saw this play out in other countries before it played out in our country. Luckily, in certain ways, we didn't see it play out as badly as in other countries. And I'm saying that because although we've had conflicts and we had protests and riots, other countries had a lot worse than that and had very very huge extremes that they saw. Last year, I spoke out about those things. I addressed other countries. There were certain countries I did address as things happened, and we had deep conversations about protests, what those look like, and whether riots should or should not be happening, right? So in our case, we advocated for people, if they were going to protest, to make sure that their protests were nonviolent. The second thing that we advocated for, and we didn't really advocate, but we stated, you need to know that if you have a protest, COVID cases are going to go up. We stated this last year, because there was no vaccine at that time. So one of the other things that we stated was, in certain cases, it is best not to protest if it's going to cause cases to go up and increase death rates. People did an evaluation about what they thought was doable for them whenever they did a protest. And I don't we didn't say go protest. I'm saying that because there were cases where riots did happen in this country, and we flat out said rioting is not the answer. It's going to make things worse. And that everyone has a right to protest, but in the middle of a pandemic, when there is no solution to the virus, it can cause outbreaks, and it can cause increased cases and increased death rate, even if that's not what people intend. And granted, there were a lot of things that were happening where people, of course, in normal circumstances, people would protest, and it made absolute sense, right? So keep that piece in mind, right? And now there are protests also, but the majority of protests that we've seen have been nonviolent, and the majority of people, not the majority, but where in major places where the protests are happening, a high number of those people are vaccinated. So, for example, at the climate summit that was happening in Glasgow, right? There were protests that were happening there, major marches and protests, all nonviolent, and people were vaccinated. The majority of people were vaccinated, I would say. So, if not all, but it's important to recognize that, because it plays into this whole conversation on the movements themselves. So to go back to Gomez's point that the movements are political, and as Catholics, we are to have a lens and know that there is a political realm and dimension of them, but also in Gomez's case, he was saying it may not align with our Catholic faith if it's too political. And he was saying stay focused on Christ. So the way that I took that statement was, you need to have Christ front and center first, and then, and yes, there's Catholic social teaching in the church, and then you take whatever action it is that you are meant to take in alignment with your faith. That is the way I took his everything that he said. I did not take it in a negative direction. And then after I already read it, I saw what other, the backlash and what was being said in relation to that. Gomez's point is, really make sure that you are aligned with your faith. Make sure that you are aligned with Christ and you're grounded in that, and that you are following the movement of the Holy Spirit, but you are following it in alignment with that, versus the way some people took it, which was do not protest or do not speak up for what is right, good, and just. So that needs to be recognized. There was a whole other point that was made that had to do with the protests being backed by Marxist thought. And this goes back to the whole option of the poor, or doing what's best for the poor. There's a lot I could say about this topic. I'm trying to keep it brief, so it's not so in detail, but I'm going to go to the lens of COVID and the pandemic first. Throughout COVID, throughout the pandemic, we've seen some countries totally fall apart. We've seen the poor become more poor. We have seen devastation. We have seen crimes against humanity. We have seen so many different things, where what was present and happening before the pandemic, the negative things, the injustices that were happening before the pandemic, became heightened and worse in some of the countries. And extremely unjust. So for anyone right now to say not to look at the poor, or not to speak on behalf of the poor, saying that in itself is unjust. And I'm not saying that's what Gomez said. I'm stating in general that is unjust. In addition to that, the pandemic itself causes every country and every nation to reevaluate what was happening before and how to change it for the better. For the better. That includes addressing poverty. That includes addressing what is happening with the poor globally, and in your countries. It includes that. That is not based in Marxist theory. It's not. That is the truth and reality of what the world is in the state of the world right now. and overcoming the pandemic. And for most people during the pandemic, they had a major wake-up call. They realized that we need to be better human beings, that the whole human race actually needs to do a better job at everything. So what does that look like? What does that concretely look like in the world today, moving forward through the pandemic? This is part of the conversation that's happening right now, and making sure that that movement forward isn't for someone's political agenda, but that it's actually for the good of the people. That's part of the whole point here. Because later on, once the pandemic's over, we don't want to be going back and having to revisit things and say, oh, this politician did this for this reason or that reason or that reason for their own agenda, right? It's not what it's about. To be a political leader and to be a true leader in the world today, it is never about your agenda. It is never about that. It is always about what is good for the people. Always about that. Agendas mean nothing. 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 You can have the most beautiful agenda in the whole wide world and not fulfill it. It doesn't matter what your agenda is. It matters what is good for the people. And if your agenda doesn't include that, your agenda needs to be thrown out anyway. So there's that whole dynamic also. So that's a whole other reason why Gomez stated what he stated about political movements. If certain countries are using movements and inspire, what's the word I want to use? Really pushing people to engage in political movements just for their own agenda, that's not okay. That is also unjust. That's using the people. Using the people is unjust. That's not okay. If it is a movement that is on behalf of the good of the people and trying to create change for the globe in a positive way, in a nonviolent way, right? And it's a major area that is in alignment with your faith and your faith tradition and what that looks like and your relationship with God and the Holy Spirit, then you're staying grounded in what Gomez stated to be grounded in. For Catholics, it's Christ, right? So you're actually living out your faith. This whole question about what it looks like to live out your faith, it includes an action element. It includes taking action. It includes speaking out for those who do not have a voice. It includes standing in solidarity with people to create the change that needs to happen. Because that is the level of that's the level of spiritual consciousness we're at. You also have to recognize that during the pandemic, God has fully broken through. God has fully broken through everyone's hard-heartedness. There's 3 things that I always ask myself, almost always ask myself, unless I'm in unless something really beyond crazy happens, that I always ask myself before I do something. And before I make a decision to say something, before I take that step. It's part of my discernment process and in the way I discern the Holy Spirit and what's being asked of me. Those 3 things are, is it loving? Is it kind? And is it merciful? Is it loving? Is it kind? Is it merciful? If it is not those 3 things, I don't say it. I don't do it. I don't move in that direction. If it conflicts with that in a major way, I don't do it. And I know that it's not for the good of all the people. God's desires for humanity are always loving, kind, and merciful. All three: loving, kind, and merciful. So to make sure that I'm in alignment with that, I always ask myself those three things. And yes, there are times when I've said things that have been brutal. People know this. Like, there have been times when I've had to really call out politicians. There have been times when I've had to call out priests. There's been times when I've had to call out other religious leaders, normal people, even my own children, right? So, but the three questions I always ask first, as well as others, is it loving, is it kind, and is it merciful? And why? Why am I saying what I'm saying? Why do I feel called to do this or that, right? So I think if you look at that, it should help you to figure out like what's really true for you and what's really good for all the people, especially now during this time, while all of you are trying to figure out a way forward through the pandemic. And so that's for political leaders, religious leaders, and all the leaders, but also what that role is in your own life as a regular person and a human being on the face of the planet, and what that looks like for you, and what causes you support or don't support, or all of those areas, as someone who's a lay leader in the church, and then also as someone who is not. You don't even have to be a Catholic to have this type of, heart knowledge and head knowledge, right? Or perspective to navigate through some of the things that are happening right now, or to find a solution to what's happening, certain things that are happening right now, right? And to be able to communicate with other people, or, all of those things. So that piece should help. There's a lot more I could say. I'm not going to say it because it gets into okay, fine. I'll go into it a little bit. Part of what Gomez brought up was George Floyd. Gomez recognized in what he said that what happened to George Floyd was unjust. He recognized that. I recognized that last year. Even I stated that last year. It was unjust. But there is also a level where protests turned into anger and hatred, causing a greater divide, and caused riots, right? So riots brought more destruction in the middle of a pandemic when we were already destroyed, and we should be honoring everybody's life, right? And valuing every person's life. So it economically brought even more issues. So there is that dynamic, but then there's also the topic of the anger and the hatred that needs to end across the board, across every single last person in this country. Because when the bitterness, the anger, the resentment, and the hatred come up and are acted out, it's detrimental to all of humanity. It's detrimental not only to the people it involves, but right now, all of humanity. And I'm saying that because as each issue comes up in this country, and I'm not saying we're not going to have issues, but as each issue comes up in this country, time and energy has to be focused on it. Resources have to be focused on it, right? Like which pulls away from the whole overarching goal of ending the pandemic globally, right? As these little, and they're not little, the protests the protests last year that led to riots were not little. They were not little. But the point is that, and I'm not saying, again, I made it clear last year what happened to George Floyd was unjust, right? The point is that anger and hatred only breed anger and hatred. Love is what breeds love. Martin Luther King Jr. made that completely clear. He fully lived that out and believed that. That included nonviolent protests. And I'm not just saying this for our country, I'm saying this for the globe, okay? Because there's a lot of different things happening right now, and so it just needs to be said. So that is also a whole part of this. And this is again where Gomez would say the political movement, the political aspect trying to back some of these things is wrong and unjust. Just like the politics behind what happened with George Floyd were unjust, right? So I think that's the best way for me to describe and really to help people to understand a little bit more about what Gomez is referring to and why he's saying it. Gomez also knows that if things continue to escalate in certain ways between different groups of people, it could be very bad and very detrimental. So that's one reason why he's saying if you focus on Christ and then put yourself into whatever the Holy Spirit is moving you into or asking you to do or whatever, then it's better than just going by. It's better than allowing yourself just to react to a political situation or just to be in angry bitterness mode. And that's across the board, no matter your race, ethnicity, no matter the conflict, no matter the problem. It's called dialoguing with humanity. It's what it's called. To dialogue with humanity, to dialogue with like another human being, you have to be able to take a step back and take everything in and allow yourself to stay grounded in what you know the truth is and not be swayed so much by what other people's political agendas are. That's just a truth. Otherwise, you'll be so reactionary that things will just become very beyond chaotic. Again, is it loving? Is it kind? Is it merciful? When you ask those three things, you will not be doing something out of hatred. You will not be doing something out of envy or spite or discrimination or prejudice or all of those areas, right, that we're trying to move past or heal and cause not to be in existence anymore, right? So that's one of the reasons why Gomez said some of the things that he said. There's a whole other dimension to this also, which I'm going to speak on in 1 minute.